Infertile rancher rescued an orphaned girl from a cruel past. Her journey redefined Wild West stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. He had cattle, land, and a house strong enough to stand against the wind, yet Samuel Harper's life was hollow, heavy with silence. Then came a ragged girl with eyes too old for her years. What followed was no gunfight, but a quiet western tale where kindness, more than bullets, changed everything. He had land, cattle, and a sturdy home, yet the silence in Samuel Harper's house was louder than any storm. Texas, late 1880s. Morning didn't come soft here. It came hard, with a glare that cut across the plains and pulled long shadows from the dry, cracked earth. On the rise above the valley, where mesquite and cactus clung to the dust like stubborn memories, the Harper Ranch sat weathered and still. The house of rough-hewn timber, a leaning barn, and a scatter of corrals wore the same coat of red dust that never truly washed away. Samuel Harper sat on the porch steps, a tin cup of coffee balanced in one calloused hand. The chair beneath him groaned, the way old wood does when it has known too many years of sun. He didn't rush the day. He hadn't rushed much of anything in a long while. His eyes traveled the range to where cattle moved slow as drifting clouds, dark specks against a sea of yellowed grass. A hawk wheeled above, sharp and patient. Folks in town would have called him a successful man. He owned land, had head of cattle enough to keep him comfortable, and a house sturdy enough to outlast storms. But Samuel knew better. There was a hollowness to comfort when it echoed through empty rooms. Inside, Clara moved about the kitchen, her steps light, practiced, quiet. She was 40 now, still handsome in her way, though weariness had settled into the corners of her eyes. Once, she had spoken of children, of little feet on these wooden floors, of laughter spilling through the doorways. Those talks had faded after too many seasons of loss. Now, when Samuel caught her staring out the window, it wasn't the horizon she saw. It was the space where a child should have been running. They didn't speak of it anymore. There was no need. Silence held the truth better than words could. It was there at breakfast, in the soft clink of spoon on plate. It was there in the evenings, when Clara sat by lamplight with her needle and thread, and Samuel smoked his pipe without a word. Some mornings, when the sun caught the dust just right, Samuel imagined the sound of small boots thumping across the porch, a laugh chasing through the yard. The sound never came, of course, only the wind and the creak of the house as it settled deeper into the earth. He told himself he was too old for dreaming, but still, with every sip of bitter coffee, the wanting was there, quiet, persistent, like a dry well holding on to the memory of water. Samuel never said it out loud, but the truth was simple. He longed for something he could not buy, something he and Clara had prayed for, fought for, and lost to the passing years. And so each day began the same: coffee on the porch, cattle on the range, and an emptiness that no one dared to name. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that fate would soon lay in his path a thin, ragged girl whose very presence would change the silence of that house forever. Dusty Creek looked alive on the surface, but inside the Harper home, days passed like echoes with no laughter to break them. Dusty Creek was a town built on tired backs and wind-blown earth. Its single street ran straight as a rifle barrel, lined with false front stores that looked braver than they really were. A saloon, a smithy, a feed store, each one keeping just enough business to last another season. On Sundays, the church bell rang thin and lonely, as if it too wondered how long folks would keep answering. For the Harpers, life beat to a quieter rhythm out on the ranch. Samuel's mornings began before the sun had cleared the mesquite, his boots crunching across the yard toward the barn. The cattle waited, restless, steam rising from their nostrils in the chill of dawn. He checked fences, patched brakes with barbed wire, and watered the stock from the windmill-fed troughs. Work was steady, never-ending, but it was honest, and it kept his hands too busy for his thoughts to wander far. Clara's world was smaller, but no less demanding. She kept the hearth warm, the bread rising, the laundry flapping on the line when the weather allowed. She stitched shirts for Samuel, boiled coffee dark enough to hold a man upright, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that had only deepened with the years. She seldom complained, at least not out loud. Her size said enough. Evenings were the hardest. After supper, Samuel would sit on the porch, pipe smoke curling in the dim light, listening to the coyotes call from the hills. Clara would take her sewing to the lamp by the window. Sometimes their eyes met, and for a breath they seemed about to speak. But words rarely crossed the room. What was there to say that hadn't been spoken or swallowed 100 times before? Neighbors saw them as solid, dependable people, and they were. But no one outside those wooden walls understood the weight of silence that pressed in after the day's work was done. No laughter carried through the rafters, no small voice asked questions at the table, just the shuffle of two grown souls moving around each other like dancers who had forgotten the steps. Life, in its plain and unyielding way, went on. Days folded into weeks, weeks into seasons. The land demanded everything, and in return, it gave just enough to keep a family afloat. Yet, in the quiet hours, Samuel felt the truth settle heavier each year. A ranch could be rich with cattle, but poor in spirit, and a marriage could endure storms, but still ache for what it never held. Neither Samuel nor Clara knew it yet, but the pattern of their days, the chores, the silences, the careful distance, was about to be broken, not by fortune, not by fire, but by the smallest and most fragile of arrivals. At a dusty market square, Samuel saw a girl whose eyes were too sharp for her years, and against his own reason, he bought her freedom. It was on a market day, in the heart of a dusty summer, that Samuel Harper's quiet pattern gave way. He had driven the wagon into Dusty Creek with a load of hides and tallow, the kind of business that paid bills but never stirred a man's blood. The town was restless that morning, horses tied to rails, stamping at flies, wagons creaking in from outlying farms, and the air thick with the smell of sweat and hot iron. Samuel bartered at the feed store, tipped his hat to the blacksmith, and was ready to head home when a sharp voice carried down the street. He turned and saw a knot of men gathered near the edge of the square, where a rough pen of slats had been thrown together. Inside it stood a few thin figures, children, ragged, eyes wide. He knew what it was without asking. Hard times drove families to desperate choices. Some sold their young ones off to work in kitchens, on small farms, or worse. Folks called it apprenticeship, but everyone knew it for what it was. Samuel had no mind to get involved. He'd seen too much of it already in his life, and the sight never sat right with him. Still, as he made to turn away, a movement caught his eye. A girl, no more than 13, was shoved forward by a heavy-set trader. Her hair was tangled, the color of dry earth, and her dress hung off her frame like a sack. She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She simply stood, chin raised a fraction, her eyes scanning the crowd the way a hawk sizes up a valley. There was something in those eyes, sharp, alive, that rooted Samuel where he stood. Most children at such auctions wore the dull look of the beaten, but not this one. She was measuring exits, watching hands, gauging her chances. It was the look of someone too young to have learned survival, yet forced into it all the same. The trader barked out a price, low enough to draw quick interest. A farmer Samuel knew stepped forward, a man with a reputation for driving stock, and people the same way, hard until they broke. The girl's shoulders stiffened, and for a heartbeat her gaze flicked to Samuel. Not pleading, not asking, just meeting his eyes with something unreadable, something that cut deeper than words. Before he had fully thought it through, Samuel spoke. His voice carried over the noise, flat and firm. "I'll take her." The trader blinked, then grinned at the unexpected profit. The farmer muttered, turned away. The girl didn't flinch, didn't smile. She only looked at Samuel, long and steady, as though trying to decide if she had traded one kind of hard life for another. A slip of paper changed hands. A price was paid. And just like that, a man who had spent years waiting on a sound that never came, children's laughter in his house, found himself leading a thin, watchful orphan toward his wagon. She climbed up without help, sitting stiff as a board on the bench beside him, The reins creaked in Samuel's hands as he steered the team back toward open country. For a long while neither spoke, the road stretching dusty and endless ahead. Yet in the silence, Samuel felt it already. Something had shifted. He didn't know what it meant or what would come of it, but the rhythm of his days, the silence he had carried like a second skin, would never be quite the same again. She came under their roof, but not yet into their hearts. Their house grew heavier with unspoken fears. The wagon rolled into the Harper yard just as the sun was beginning its slow slide behind the ridgeline. Shadows stretched long over the corrals, and the air held that tired hush that comes after a long day's heat. Samuel set the brake, climbed down, and turned to help the girl, but she was already on the ground, small boots hitting dust with a soft thud. Clara stood on the porch, hands folded in her apron. She had been expecting supplies, perhaps a new bridle, not this thin stranger with wary eyes and a dress gone threadbare from too many men's. For a moment she said nothing, her gaze moving over the child's hollow cheeks, the scabs on her knees, the raw defiance in her posture. Samuel cleared his throat, though no explanation felt adequate. "She'll stay a while," he said simply. Clara's eyes flicked to her husband's face, searching, weighing. She did not argue. She only nodded once, the kind of nod that carried more questions than words could hold, and turned back into the house. The girl, Eliza, that was the name scrawled on the paper, was given the small room off the kitchen. It had once stored flour and canned peaches, now mostly empty but for a narrow bed and a wooden chest. Samuel lit a lamp, set it on the stand, and left her there without ceremony. At supper, the three of them sat together for the first time. The table, built broad enough for a family that had never come, now seemed even larger with the silence that filled it. Clara passed bread, set stew before the girl, and waited. Eliza ate carefully, eyes down, as though expecting the food to be taken back. Samuel chewed slowly, his gaze fixed on nothing, listening not to the scrape of spoons, but to the absence of talk, the unspoken things hanging in the air. When the dishes were cleared, Clara gathered them in her arms and moved to the wash basin. Samuel stepped onto the porch, pipe in hand. Behind him, he could hear the faint splash of water, the rustle of fabric as Eliza moved about the small room. Nothing more. It was not hostility that settled in that house, nor kindness, not yet. It was a barrier of silence, built from years of longing and the sudden presence of someone who reminded them both of what they'd lost. Clara could not look at the girl without feeling the ache of absence twist sharper. Samuel could not look at Clara without knowing what she feared to name. And Eliza, well, she seemed to sense it all. She kept to herself those first days, doing only what she was told, speaking only when necessary. She carried herself with the stiff independence of someone who had learned not to lean on others. The house was no louder with her in it. If anything, the silence deepened, grew heavier, pressing on them all like a storm cloud, waiting for the right wind. But storms, Samuel knew, always came, and sometimes they broke the air in ways a man never expected. In the girl's silence, Samuel and Clara saw themselves reflected back, raw, unhealed, and achingly familiar. By the second week, the girl had begun to settle into a rhythm of her own. It wasn't the kind of rhythm Clara set for her, nor the one Samuel expected. It was her own cadence, quiet but capable, as though she'd been carrying chores in her bones long before the Harpers ever saw her. At dawn, she was already awake, folding her blanket with careful hands, fetching kindling for the stove without being asked. She seemed to know when water in the pot needed more wood beneath it, or when the chickens were restless in their coop. One morning, Clara stepped out to the garden and found Eliza already on her knees, pulling weeds with the slow patience of someone who understood that survival often lived in small labors. Samuel noticed too. He watched her from a distance as she carried buckets from the well, too large for her slight frame, but balanced with practiced care. She moved through the place like she'd lived there years, as if she'd memorized every path and corner. What struck him wasn't just her skill, but the way she carried herself. Never hurried, never careless, always watching. At first, Clara bristled at the girl's presence. The sight of that thin figure moving through her kitchen unsettled her, stirred something fragile she thought she had long since buried. But there were moments when she forgot to guard herself. She'd glance up to see Eliza wiping the table in the same motion she herself used, or hear the girl humming softly as she kneaded dough, the tune crooked and sweet, much like Clara had once hummed when she believed she'd be singing to a cradle. It was then Clara saw it. The girl was a mirror, not just of herself, but of Samuel too. In Eliza's guarded silence, she saw her husband's own quiet endurance. In her sharp, watchful eyes, she saw the man he had once been, a boy who had clawed his way through hardship until he built a life with his bare hands. And in her hunger for usefulness, Clara glimpsed her own yearning to matter beyond the walls of that kitchen. The recognition unsettled them both. It made Samuel soften in ways he hadn't meant to. It made Clara ache in places she'd rather have kept numb. Neither spoke of it, but both carried the weight of the reflection. One evening, Samuel paused at the barn door, watching Eliza stand beside a skittish colt. She didn't reach for it, didn't speak. She just stood near, breathing slow, until the animal stilled, ears flicking toward her. There was no trick in it, no lesson taught, only patience, the kind born of knowing what it feels like to be half wild and wary of hands. Samuel lit his pipe and turned back toward the house, a heaviness in his chest he couldn't quite name. Clara was at the window, her needle frozen mid-stitch, watching the same scene. Their eyes met across the distance. For a moment, both saw the same truth. This child carried pieces of them both, though she shared no blood with either. The mirror had been set before them, and in its reflection, the silence of their home was beginning to crack. When the storm broke the fences, kindness broke the silence, and for the first time, arms held what words could not. The storm came sudden, as they often do on the plains. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron, clouds piling high and heavy, the air sharp with the taste of rain and electricity. Samuel was out mending fence when the first drop struck, fat and scattered. By the time he looked back toward the ranch house, the wind had begun its wild song through the mesquite. The cattle bawled, restless, and the horses stamped in their stalls. Samuel quickened his pace toward the barn. He wasn't the only one. Through the sheets of rain, he caught sight of Eliza running hard, skirts plastered to her legs, hair whipping loose in the gale. She was headed straight for the smaller shed, where the young gelding had been tied. The roof was shuddering under the storm's weight. "Girl," Samuel started, but the wind tore his voice away. She ducked inside just as the door banged open on its hinges. By the time he reached her, she was braced against the wall, pushing back a beam that threatened to fall, the horse trembling beside her. Her thin arm shook, but her jaw was set. Samuel stepped in, shoulder to wood, and together they forced it upright long enough for him to nail it fast. Rain ran down his face, mud sucking at his boots, but the shed held. When the worst of it passed, he turned to find Eliza standing still, chest heaving, eyes wide, not with fear, but with stubborn pride. They walked back to the house in silence, both soaked to the bone. Clara met them at the door, her face pale, hands clutching a shawl to her chest. She pulled the girl inside first, wrapping her in a blanket, her fingers trembling as they brushed wet hair from the child's forehead. Without thinking, she drew Eliza close, holding her tight against her heart, as though she had been waiting all her life for the right moment to do so. Eliza stiffened for a breath, unaccustomed to such a thing. Then she sagged, letting the warmth of it sink in. Samuel, watching from the doorway, saw his wife's eyes close as if a weight she'd carried for years had finally cracked. No words passed between them. None were needed. It was not a declaration, not a promise. It was something simpler, more binding, the unspoken offering of kindness, freely given, freely received. That night, Clara made stew, thick with potatoes and meat, and pressed a bowl into Eliza's hands as though feeding her were the most natural act in the world. Later, she laid out a nightdress she'd kept folded away for years, meant for a daughter that never came. Eliza said little, only "thank you," in a voice softer than before. But Samuel heard the difference. The edge of suspicion was gone, replaced by something fragile, something that could, with time, grow roots. In the Harper house, silence had long been a barrier. But now, by way of a storm and a trembling embrace in the kitchen lamplight, it had shifted into something else. A silence no longer empty, but full, holding space for trust, for a kind of belonging that neither Samuel nor Clara dared hope for. And so, with no proclamation, no vow, the first door had been unlocked, the key not forged in iron, but in kindness. A stranger rode in demanding the girl, but it was silence, not gunfire, that sent him away. Word in small towns travels on the wind. By late autumn, whispers reached the Harper place, rumors that a man had come asking about a girl, thin and sharp-eyed, once seen in a trader's pen at Dusty Creek. No one knew his name for sure, only that he'd ridden through more than once, and folks didn't like the look of him. Samuel heard it at the smithy, then again outside the feed store. He didn't mention it to Clara at first, but she had already felt the shift in the air. She had begun watching the road in the evenings, her needlework forgotten on her lap. Eliza, too, sensed it. Children always do. She grew quieter, though her eyes never stopped their restless measuring. It was near dusk when the rider finally came. A lean figure on a dark horse, the kind of man who carried trouble the way others carried dust. He reined up at the Harper gate, sat tall in the saddle, and called out in a voice rough with authority. "Got business with the girl." Samuel stepped from the porch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "She's no business of yours." The man's eyes narrowed. His horse sidestepped in the gathering dark. Behind Samuel, the door creaked. Eliza stepped out onto the porch boards, the lamplight spilling behind her. She didn't hide, didn't cling to Clara's skirts. She only stood, chin lifted the smallest degree, watching the man the same way she'd once watched that crowded square, like a creature cornered, but unwilling to yield. For a long, weighted moment, the yard held nothing but the soft hiss of wind through grass. The man shifted in his saddle, perhaps waiting for fear to show in the girl's face. But fear never came. Instead, there was silence. A silence sharp enough to draw lines in the dirt, to stake claim. The rider spat, muttered something low, and pulled the reins. His horse turned, hooves striking sparks on the hard ground as he rode back into the dark. Eliza exhaled then, a sound barely louder than a sigh. Clara's hand came to her shoulder, steady and warm. Samuel didn't speak. He only watched the road until the last echo of hooves had faded. No shots fired, no fight. Yet the battle had been fought and won in the open quiet of that yard. For the first time, Eliza had stood with them, not as a stranger under their roof, but as someone who had chosen to stay, and in her stillness, they had chosen her too. The house that night was not louder, but different. The silence carried a weight that was no longer heavy with emptiness, but full with something unspoken, something hard-earned and fragile, belonging. The winter was still hard, but for the first time in years, the Harper home no longer felt empty. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the northern plains with a sharpness that cracked the water troughs and drove the cattle close to the windbreaks. Life on the Harper ranch slowed to a steady endurance, mending tack by lamplight, hauling wood, keeping the fires fed against the cold that pressed at the windows. Through it all, Eliza found her place. She rose before dawn to help Clara stoke the stove. Her small hands blackened with ash, but quick with the work. She learned the way of bread rising, of soup simmering low through the day. When chores spilled outside, she trudged through snowdrifts beside Samuel, boots far too big, but stubbornly keeping pace, carrying buckets of feed with a determination that made him hide a smile. The house, once steeped in hollow quiet, began to sound different, not loud, not brimming with chatter, but alive in small ways. The soft scrape of Eliza's chair at the table, the hum of her voice as she copied Clara's tune at the washboard, even the muffled laughter once, when the pup from the barn snatched a biscuit from her hand. That sound startled Clara so deeply she set down her spoon mid-stir, tears pricking her eyes before she could help it. Evenings took on a gentler rhythm. Samuel would smoke his pipe by the fire while Clara read aloud from the worn family Bible. Eliza sat nearby, eyes tracing the words, learning slowly, lips moving in silence as though catching each letter by hand. It was not the life of riches or glory, but something steadier, like water finally finding its channel after years lost in dry stone. Clara softened. She fussed over the girl's hair, pressed quilts tighter around her shoulders at night, and in quiet moments watched her as a woman watches a promise she thought long buried. Samuel noticed, but said nothing. For his part, he taught Eliza to mend tack, to mark calves, to reckon numbers on the ledger. She listened, head bent, her hunger for learning unspoken but fierce. The three of them moved through the cold season like a team of horses harnessed together, each pulling, each giving weight to the other. By spring, the land itself seemed to answer. Grass pushed through the thaw, calves stumbled into the world, and Clara planted a row of flowers by the kitchen door. She'd never bothered before. Flowers seemed frivolous when silence filled the house. But now, with Eliza's laughter ringing faintly at the chicken coop, Clara's hands found the soil again. It was a quiet season, without spectacle, but to Samuel and Clara, it was the first in many years that didn't feel empty, and to Eliza, it was the first that felt like home. Under the wide Texas sky, they found what they had longed for, not blood, but belonging. Spring ripened into summer, and the Harper place wore a different look than it had in years past. The fences still sagged in places, the barn still needed mending after every hard wind, and the work was as endless as ever. But there was a change in the air, quiet yet unmistakable. Clara's flowers bloomed by the kitchen door, bright splashes of color against the weathered wood. Eliza tended them each morning, stooping low with the same care she gave the hens and the garden rose. Samuel often paused on his way to the corrals, watching her small figure move among the blooms. It struck him that the child was no longer merely surviving. She was planting. That simple act carried more hope than any sermon he'd ever heard. Evenings grew softer. Samuel still sat on the porch with his pipe, but now there were 2 chairs beside him. Clara's hands rested gentle on her lap, no longer always busy with mending, as though she allowed herself, at last, to simply sit. Eliza leaned against the railing, hair catching the last of the sun, her laughter small but sure when the pup tangled itself, chasing fireflies. No one called her daughter. No one said adoption or promise or forever. Words weren't needed. Belonging had already settled in, as natural as dusk falling across the prairie. One night, when the coyotes sang far off in the hills and the cattle rustled easy in the pastures, Samuel looked out over the land he had fought so long to keep. The house behind him glowed with lamplight, Clara's voice low and kind, Eliza humming as she dried the last dish of supper. For the first time in years, the silence did not press against him like a weight. It felt full of breath, of warmth, of something unnamed but steady. He realized then that his quiet wish, the one he had never spoken, not even to Clara, had come true in its own unlooked-for way. Not in the sound of a cradle rocking, nor the surety of bloodlines, but in the fragile, fierce presence of a girl who had walked out of dust and hunger and chosen, in her own guarded way, to stay. The Harper place had not become louder. It had become alive, and under the vast Texas sky, that was enough. Out on the prairie, life rarely gives you what you asked for. More often, it gives you what you didn't expect, sometimes in the shape of a storm, sometimes in the shape of a frail girl with wary eyes. The Harpers had carried silence for years, a silence that felt like a burden. In time, that silence became something else, a place where kindness could take root, where love could grow without needing to be named. The West has always been a land of second chances, though not the kind written in bold letters. Its second chances come quiet, through a steady hand on a skittish horse, or a warm meal laid before someone who thought they'd never be welcome again. And in those moments, a man, a woman, even a child can find a home where once there was only emptiness. If you've carried silence in your own life, if you've known the long ache of waiting, maybe this story sits close to you. I'd be honored if you shared what it stirred up, whether in memory or in hope or in the simple act of still believing in decency. Because out here, under the wide sky, healing isn't found in words shouted loud. It's found in the quiet decision to stay, to care, and to keep the fire lit for someone who needs it.